Hey everyone, my name is Cole and welcome back to yet another episode of How to Design Levels for Video Games. In the previous episode, we dove deep into the concepting stage of level design, and we explored many of the different things that we can do in order to solidify an idea for a level. In this episode, we're going to move on to the next stage and look at how we can create the design and layout of our levels. I'll explain many of the different techniques you can employ to start blocking out and mapping your levels, as well as discuss how you can workshop different gameplay ideas into them. And of course, I'll be discussing how I employed all of these strategies during the design of my Super Dungeon Maker level. All of the things I'm going to talk about in this episode are generally seen as common industry standard strategies for level design, according to my own personal research and experience. Alright then, with that out of the way, let's begin. The first thing you're likely going to want to do here is write out a comprehensive list of areas or zones for your level. Start by considering the setting of your level and consider all of the different areas that you want to include in it. Then write all of them down. To make it even better, you could also try organizing all of these areas into smaller subcategories. To give an example based on what I did for my level, I initially decided that I wanted to have 32 rooms in total, and I broke up these rooms into different sections, including the main floor, sub-level, and upper floor. Lastly, I decided which of these rooms would have important points of interest, such as the main entrance, the central hub, the mid-boss and main boss rooms, and the exit. When you're creating your list, you should be careful to consider how these areas would fit logically within the visual theming and aesthetic of your level. For example, it would seem a bit out of place for there to be a giant urban skyscraper in the middle of a small rural town. If you're unsure of what areas would naturally fit within your level, you should spend time looking for inspiration from different sources. Try watching movies or studying different locations around the world, or even just look at the environment around you to help gather ideas. For those who don't know, a bubble diagram is a very simple diagram that connects all of the different areas of your level together. However, instead of creating a fully fledged map, it just outlines the basic layout of the level. Each area is represented by a bubble, and then you start to connect them together. There are many different ways to make a bubble diagram, but here's a couple common techniques that level designers like to use. The first and most common method simply involves connecting the bubbles together with lines. It's very simple and gets the point across well, but it's a pretty bare-bones option that lacks a lot of the finer details that the other options have. Alternatively, instead of drawing lines, you could draw directional arrows to connect the bubbles. The arrows represent how the player would get from one area to another. This way you can easily nail down the path that the player takes to reach the goal, which is great for figuring out the critical and golden paths of your level. The third option involves writing down little notes describing gameplay or story events that happen when the player moves from one area to another. This allows you to expand upon the flowchart that you created earlier, and really figure out how these events will be integrated into your level, which is very useful. And lastly, you could choose to draw the bubbles proportional in size to how big their corresponding area is actually going to be in the level. Doing it this way is probably going to give you the most visually accurate bubble diagram, which will make drawing your maps much easier. Try playing around with a couple different methods to see what works best for you. Again, every level designer is going to have a slightly different approach to things, which is totally fine as long as it's easy to read and follow. And remember, the most important thing here is that it needs to have logic to it. Why exactly does one particular area connect to another? You'll need to think about this carefully when you're arranging your diagram. Of course, you might end up with a bad bubble diagram, like this one right here. This is a diagram that I created for a level taking place in a science laboratory. There's a couple things that are rather unusual about this one. First of all, the player starts out the level in a storage room. But how did they get there in the first place? It doesn't really make sense. It would make more sense for the level to start at the main entrance, which just so happens to be where it ends on this diagram. The ammo room connects to a bathroom. It would be much more logical for it to be connected to the hallway. The elevator leads absolutely nowhere, and it should be used for something. And lastly, the end of the level is practically right next to the beginning, which renders most of the level completely worthless. Remember, an excellent level should make good use of its space and have a satisfying sense of progression. If you end up with a diagram like this, don't worry. In fact, a bad bubble diagram will actually be very useful to you in many ways, because it means that you recognize flaws with your design early on, and you can focus on ironing them out. Here's what an improved version of the diagram would look like, after fixing the issues we touched upon. One more thing I should emphasize is the importance of making your bubble diagrams well organized. If you really wanted to, you could just place all the bubbles randomly and then connect them together. However, I do recommend that you place the bubbles carefully and in the same way that you envision the areas being laid out on the map, as not only is it much clearer, but it also makes the process of transforming the diagram into a map a lot smoother. Try creating a couple different variations of your bubble diagram so you have a few ideas to work off of, and then choose the one that you think will work best. This was the first version of the diagram that I created for my level. In my bubble diagram, I had a clear vision while I was designing it. First of all, I wanted to feature a central area that branches off into both an east and west wing of the dungeon, creating a degree of symmetry. I chose to color code the different floors of the dungeon so that I could make it easy to communicate the layout of the whole dungeon. This allowed me to make one seamless diagram, rather than 3 separate diagrams for each floor. I mostly tried to position the rooms the way I planned to do so on the actual map based on the general location. I wanted to have each wing of the dungeon feel distinct in its layout, and feature plenty of branching paths. By comparison though, I wanted the basement area to be very straightforward and linear, and have it be accessed from both the east and west ends of the dungeon. At this stage, I was more concerned with thinking about which rooms would connect to which, rather than exactly how they would be connected. I wasn't necessarily thinking about which doors would be locked, nor did I think about which rooms would only be accessible with a specific item. The only thing I decided on for certain was where the player could access different floors of the dungeon. I did create a couple different iterations of the diagram, but I'll be getting to those later on. So anyway, once you've got a bubble diagram that you want to use, you can start to flesh it out and transform it into a rough map. There's a lot of different ways that you could choose to design your map, but probably the most straightforward way is to create individual designs for each of the bubbles on your diagram. Breaking your work into a series of smaller chunks is a lot less overwhelming than trying to design the entire map all at once. Once you've got a design for each area, you can begin to piece them together using your bubble diagram as a reference, and create a complete rough map. At this point, primarily focus on creating the layout of the level, and don't concern yourself too much with metrics or super precise details. You'll have plenty of opportunities to fix it up later. Typically, rough maps are designed on paper, or with tools like Photoshop or Illustrator, but there's plenty of other options, whatever works best for you. I'm going to say outright that I did things very differently here. When I was working on the dungeon, I actually did all of this much earlier on, when I was creating the list of rooms for the dungeon. I had already decided that I was going to save designing puzzles for the dungeon for the testing and revisions phase, where it would be easier to design and test them out as I went along. Since I didn't have anything to identify each room by, I was just referring to them as Room 1, Room 2, etc. So to make things easier for myself, I created rough designs for each room, and assigned each of them a number between 1 and 32. From there, I figured I would use the bubble diagram to help me figure out how I would piece together all of the rooms into a map. So yeah, I didn't do things quite the same way that I've been talking about in this episode, but remember what I've said, everybody approaches it differently. Anyways, I started arranging the rooms according to the way they were laid out in the diagram, and I ended up with this map. Right off the bat, I was not particularly happy with how the west wing of the dungeon looked. It looked a lot more straightforward than I had envisioned and didn't have enough of the branching paths I wanted it to have. So from there I went back to my bubble diagram and rearranged a few things, creating the second iteration, and then turned that into a map. This one mainly made changes to the west wing and the basement, as well as moving the mid-boss from room 29 to room 13. I I liked the layout of this one a lot more, so I spent some time adding a few extra details to it, such as the locations of locked doors and keys, and placing some pits that would block the player's progress. Lastly, I created one final iteration of the bubble diagram and map, which only had one major change, moving the dungeon's exit from the upper floor to the main floor. This was because I discovered that you can only place the goal on the main floor in Super Dungeon Maker. So in the end, this was the final version of the rough map that I settled on. By doing this, I was able to come to a decision about what the golden path would look like and how the player would get through the dungeon from beginning to end. Lastly, you can create a more detailed version of your rough map that closely follows the metrics you decided on earlier. At this point, all of the heights, distances, and sizes of everything must be decided on. You might also choose to be a lot more specific about mapping out the different level components. You should think of this map as being very close to representing the level you wish to create in the engine. To get your metrics just right, it's a great idea to use stuff like grid paper, or software such as Tiled, which is what I'll be using. In the end, I created two versions of the tile map for my dungeon. The first one was nothing more than just a one-to-one recreation of the rough map, but remade using tiled so that it followed exact metrics. The second version featured some changes and resizing to the overall design, and it also notably features an attempt to map out some of the gameplay features of the dungeon. However, I quickly realized that it would just be a lot easier to save this part for actually creating the level in Super Dungeon Maker, so I mostly gave up on it. For anybody wondering, the tile set that I used for these maps was made by a user named Poikilos on opengameart.org. If you're having trouble figuring out how you want to design your level, here's a couple of great tips that I would recommend for workshopping different design ideas. Specifically, how you can look at the different tools and mechanics at your disposal and think of interesting ways in which they can be combined together to create unique dynamics. Begin by thinking about the individual properties of each mechanic you'll be using in the level and brainstorm different uses for them. Determine the most obvious uses first, and then try and figure out how they could be flipped on their heads and used in unexpected ways. You should consider the importance of designing something that's fun to play versus designing something complex. You may think that you have a really cool, clever idea for something, but chances are it's not all that fun to play, so make sure you keep that in mind. One thing that many designers like to do here is to jump into the engine and create a playground of sorts to test out and analyze each mechanic, and how they can be combined together. Another helpful thing you could do would be to create micro-diagrams that demonstrate singular concepts rather than entire parts of your level. You could create a bunch of these and then connect them together to create a complete design. This links back to what I said earlier about how it's significantly easier to break up the work into smaller chunks and then piece it all together. Just think about things one step at a time. Hopefully all of these tips will help you to get on the right track to creating some excellent level designs. And so with that, we've reached the end of the design and layout stage of level design. I hope you enjoy getting to see all of your hard work start to pay off and take shape. And as we keep going forward, your levels are just going to keep getting better and better. That's all for this episode of How to Design Levels for Video Games. In the next episode, we'll be moving on to the third stage of the design process, the testing and revisions phase. There, we'll explore how we can continually iterate on our levels to get them just right. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.